Chapter 5. The Dive. You cannot play a FPR file on an ADR player, and you cannot interface a hammer with a screw, not unless you wish that the screw no longer be a screw when you are done. The human mind cannot be digitized. To accurately play the human mind in a digital space would require that every neuron and connection be emulated or simulated. It is not something that can be done with the technology that we have, advanced as it is. However, what we can do is create synthetic brains and then use the nanites within them to simulate brain states of an already imprinted save point, and then use the telemetry from these little machines to interface an analog brain with the digital space. It is only through this use of brain drives that we have managed to come within striking distance of the dream of a digitized human consciousness. From Whence Comes Mind? Fundamentals of Neurocomputing, 3rd edition.
The ride back to Joseph was routine. Even close to midnight, the shuttle was packed with commuters, mostly shipyard employees. Some were the sort of entry-level men who were desperate for the job but yet couldn't afford to live near their work. Others were more senior employees, who for one reason or another couldn't live in the local habitat. Adam was an exclusive place, and it wasn't only money that got you entry. The unmarried found it very difficult to obtain living space on the habitat, as did the impious or degenerate. It was a burden for anyone to pay the constant toll of interhab shuttle fares. But shipyard jobs were some of the best in the entire universe. And thus, even with the extra burden of a twice-daily passage through the black, there were some who were willing to make the sacrifice. It was about halfway through the transit when we got a ping from Central. The CSU team had finished up, and the mine divers were all set up. There was not going to be any sleep for either of us, not for the next few days. All our overtime slips were pre-signed, and our meal budget was tripled. I saw Jermaine popping a few amphetamines from his pill case. I had no need for that, in more than one way. First, there was no need for me to physically ingest anything. Had I wished, Nivash could have triggered my pharma gland and produced any number of concoctions that could have focused my attention, reduced my tiredness, or washed away my anxiety in a sea of medication. However, my body was not even close to its limits. Advantages of a post-human physique. That being said, 4 transitions through the black corridors in short succession was a tax that was onerous even for me. While I was stronger in body and mind than my partner, our souls were equally vulnerable to the scouring light of the seraphim. Exertion of the soul reflected back onto body and mind, and in a strange quirk of oniric physics, the price was best described as a percentage of will and vitality. My hand was quivering, and my skin had gone ashen as I emerged from my 4th passage. The monk on watch made a small movement towards me. Her posture was one of concern. Maribel St. Young was a slender girl with delicate features and a buttoned nose. I tried not to let my fear of her show, but those ice-blue eyes caught my slip, and in an instant her stance had changed from empathy to suspicion. The temperature in the spaceport corridor dropped a few noticeable degrees as the ire of the little ice princess began devouring local entropy. Her eyes narrowed, and I felt an invisible questing something slither past me. Again, I couldn't help but cower. The barest brush of her halo was unbearable. I could feel myself starting to hyperventilate. I could have controlled it if I was in my right mind, but even the conditioning that was designed to protect me from myself was unable to keep up. The paladin's focus intensified, and the fangs of the wolf of winter started to close around me. The temperature in that corridor had dropped enough that it was starting to get uncomfortable. Rime was starting to form on the tips of the young woman's eyelashes. As cold as it was in my vicinity, the intensity of the phenomena was obviously dozens, if not hundreds of times more intense around the monk. All monks were tougher and faster than any human being, and most monsters. But each of the monastic orders had their own little trick. That one thing that made them special. Then with all the speed it had built up, the sensation vanished, and the temperature in the hallway snapped back to normal. There was a ripple of heat that burst from the young girl, and moisture suddenly condensed on every exposed surface. All the entropy that Maribel had eaten was regurgitated in an instant. I no longer existed to her. Her inquest had found whatever it was looking for, and she had moved on, and those ice-blue eyes were now flitting warily across the rest of the commuters. I felt Germain's large hand on my shoulder. He had seen the exchange and was offering his pity. There was a burst of anger in my breast, and I had a sudden fantasy of decking him. Still, it would be bad politics to seem ungrateful, so I choked on my bile and did my best to diplomatically wave him off. It was a sign of how shaken I was that I wasn't certain if I succeeded. The rest of the trip was made in utter silence. Germain was walking fast, and I had no qualms about keeping things brisk. The fresh air gave me time to recenter and recharge. I felt a churning in my abdomen as my gundral organ converted electricity to sugars, which from the slight tingling in my fingertips were greedily being absorbed by the nanobees of my diamantine gland. The damage the Seraphim's light had done to my soul was reflected back onto my body. And while there was nothing to be done about the former, my father's body was quickly reversing the latter. I wasn't on the best of terms with the man, but his craftsmanship was second to none. This time, instead of a dramatic aerial show, we entered the victim's Ratsy building through its well-appointed lobby. The android doorman waved us through without hesitation, and we took the velvet upholstered elevator to the 17th level. It was on that short ride that Germain grunted out the first words since the shuttle.
Who do you think we got?
A transparent olive branch. Still, I was feeling much better, and looking back on my behavior in the black corridor, I was ashamed enough that I almost stumbled to accept it. Think of hope. That got some laughter from Germain.
We both know who you hope we got, but I happen to know that Ristoval is on vacation.
Well, I chuckled. While seeing Blairy would be nice, I happen to know who is next up in rotation, and we are gonna be in for a ride. Germain's face crinkled in disgust.
Oh, fuck her.
He snarled, and I nodded my agreement. The mind divers had done a bit of rearranging when we were out. They had hauled both of the decedents onto the bed and deactivated the illusionary forest background, leaving the room featureless, white and much smaller. I had not been wrong. We had drawn Deacon Inspector Sarah and her crew, a severe and humorless woman for whom faith was not just a truth, but a total way of life. The deacon was in full uniform, a crisp white dress shirt, razor-sharp navy skirts, and shining black leather for the boots, belt and gloves. Her cap and inspector's chevrons that decorated the brim was held reverently by one of her minions. She stood at full attention, ramrod straight, her heels together and her hands clasped. As was typical, her plain features were drawn into a tight scowl, and she stared at me with barely contained contempt. I did my best not to grin. Technically, all three of us hold the same rank, but as the lead investigator, I was unambiguously in charge. This fact irked Denise Sarah to no end. As she quite bluntly told me last time we worked together, she believes me to be a whore, and a degenerate addict. When she was dressing me down during the runner case, I returned the favor and told her that she was a humorless cunt whose faith is nothing more than vainglory. When I spoke the words, she had turned an alarming shade of red and had come within a hair's breadth of either striking me or having a stroke. Frankly, I would have been more than happy with either outcome. Germaine lumbered in after me and gave the deacon a chilly glare. Germaine and the deacon might have gotten along famously in another life. They had very similar ideals, but alas, those very same ideals put them at loggerheads in the here and now. I found the irony to be delightful.
Inspector!
Sarah spoke the words with audible rhyme. Deacon! I infused the words with the most saccharine venom I could muster, and was rewarded with a small throbbing vein at her left temple. She had come up through the ecclesiarchy and had been granted the rank of inspector when she had been hired by the Trinity Constabulary. She was sensitive about the fact she hadn't earned her inspector status, and she was even more infuriated by the fact that Germaine and I didn't have any such hang-ups about our own honorary rank in the church. How are we doing? I gave the question an insulting maternal lilt, like I was asking a slow child about their best attempt at drawing a dog. Sarah's lip quivered once, violently, then she seemed to draw inward. She exhaled, and most of the anger but none of the hatred bled out of her. She gave me a slight inclined nod and smiled like a smug shark. I covered, but that took me aback a little.
I have prepared the remains of their minds as well as is possible. Their attacker violated both of them down at least 9 strata. This was a high-level black transformation. An effort a third as vigorous would have probably done the job just fine.
So no reaving, Athame.
Germaine mused out loud. Deacon Sarah gave a curt affirmative nod.
New record is 7.85, just last week out of Eden. Shaved elder vampire fang with a chime singer 5 binding, and I doubt there has been a quantum leap in athamic manufacture since then.
Pathway? I posed the question lightly.
Hunger.
Came the deacon's response. She grimaced slightly.
It ate them hollow.
Germaine and I both groaned in unison. That narrowed it down not at all. Hunger was the most universal poison when it came to destroying a soul. It?
No fingerprints, I am afraid.
The deacon brought one gloved finger to her lips and quirked her brow in contemplation.
As clinical and aseptic as this sort of thing can be, which I suppose is a clue in and of itself.
I nearly chortled at that. All the hitmen on the Ark were sociopaths, and clinical and aseptic was the only way they operated. It was a clue, all right. Just it didn't make things any easier. A professional hit was our worst case. There was a moment of silence, and I let out a sigh. There was no use putting it off. Let's get this dive underway. I wagged my hand. Give me the cable. Sarah gave me an arch look, and for a moment her hostility surged back. Then once again it vanished behind that smug grin.
It really is best if you let the techs hook you up.
I rolled my eyes and walked over to the dive array and grabbed one of the wrist-thick BC cables and reconfigured the head for 2048 pin male PCTA. Turning slightly away from the others, I found the side slit in my skirts and retracted the cover on my hip port and homed the cable in. I turned back to Germaine and Deacon Sarah and made a show of impatience. The deacon, for her part, was confidently configuring her own cable, a 256 SCTA unless I missed my mark. I grinned a bit. She was 3 iterations behind me in terms of raw power, and her last generation brain was unable to interface with the latest parallel attachments. As for Germaine, he was fidgeting while the deacon's minions were trying to manually access his port configuration. He looked supremely uncomfortable. He hated leaving his body behind, and moreover, he still used a skull port. Truth be told, if I had to jam a sharp metal plug into my skull, I too would be a little bit skeeved out. That was one of the reasons I had had my hip port grown. It took a bit more than a minute and a half to get all of us synced and connected. But when the prep was all done, the dive started with the abruptness of a light being flicked off. We floated in the void of the Hallows Boot lobby. Jermaine and Sarah appeared luminous and formless to my eyes, and I knew that I was the same as them. Slowly the sluggish government Hallow loaded in textures, prompts, and finally avatars. It was a bare-bones thing. The dive program had created a simple room, an unfurnished beige cube with lines of black text running in streams up and down the walls, with the occasional highlighted word or sentence indicating a link to some further menu or options. In the center hung a fragmented and chaotic cloud of lights. When you looked closer, you could see that each light was a tiny pearl that contained a confusing jumble of images. Seems sparse. Who are we looking at? I posed the question as I leaned in, trying to answer the question myself.
That is Victim B.
The deacon swept her hands downwards, and the glittering column compressed onto a wire mesh of a human brain. Most of the mesh was either dark or glowed an angry red. Only a tiny portion of the simulacrum was filled in by the light of a functional mind.
And yes, there is not much left.
I would have thought you would start with our primary victim? The deacon gave me a genuinely quizzical look.
You flagged Mark Thaler as a probable alias. I thought that a positive ID would be a top priority.
Fuck. I had forgotten about that. I shrugged and dismissed my own gaffe with a non-committal grunt, and then pretended to be engrossed by the data stream in front of me. Jermaine appeared by my elbow and joined me in examining the mind graph. He gave it a once-over and then turned to the deacon and spoke.
Do you have a vector you are favoring, or is this going to be a full load and pray?
A sour expression painted the deacon's face.
I am afraid that prayer is all that we have here.
The deacon took a deep breath and seemed to steel herself. Strange, she didn't seem the skittish type.
Let's go,
She said, and the dive engaged. The world unraveled around us, and I was afloat in the dark. It wasn't like flying, and it wasn't a void. The air had a thickness like water, and I hung hundreds of meters above a vast abyssal plain. Below me, like 1,000 deep sea worms, were the fragmented load states of our shattered soul. They writhed and screamed in a cacophony without order. This dive was simple in concept. Take a save point, a complete copy of a human mind, and load it into a cybernetic brain that could mimic that state and then interact with the resulting mind. If you did a complete load, that interaction would be like having a conversation with a fully functional person, but the great thing about a cyberbrain is that you can turn parts of it on and off. You didn't have to interact with a whole person. Instead, you could select bits and pieces to talk to. Deprive them of their inhibitions, their logic, their judgment, their past, their present, you name it. Of course, the human brain isn't a standard issue set of hardware, and it tends to store things in weird places. Sure, turning off someone's ability to lie might be great, but you also might be carving out the very memory you wanted them not lying about. This wasn't going to be like that. Our victim's soul had been destroyed. Any attempt to load the mind of our victim would fail. Their personality would begin running on the new brain. Then their mind would call out for their soul, but instead of finding its immortality, it would find a ruined husk, and that ruin would echo back into the mind, destroying it again. This dive was a full load, and it was an attempt at an end run around the problem. Load fragments of the mind, tiny portions in different combinations. Hope that you can create something that is coherent enough to give you something. Hope you don't reconstruct enough I that the shattered soul can find its mind and revisit the destruction upon it. The dive team was creating a halo, linked to the mind farm buried beneath the alifecture. The screaming fields I beheld were the 1,000 partial brain states of Victim B that were being loaded into the mind farm. I beheld his instant of dying from 1,000 different perspectives. A 9-strata violation meant that there was almost nothing left. The odds of a successful load state was minuscule. Still, there was some hope. Jermaine, Deacon Sarah, and myself were each in our own dive layer, each looking down onto the same fragmented load states. Each of us brought with us our whole lives, all our experiences, all our humanity. We could reach out and touch each of these broken fragments and try to bridge that which they are missing with who we were. I let my gaze relax and drifted downwards through the forest of screaming ghosts. A first pass eliminated good 90% of the fragments. They were riddled with the retrograde damage of a black transformation. The demon, Vudak, who was running command and control on the dive, couldn't distinguish superficial damage from fatal damage, so he threw everything at me. Let me make the final choice. This wasn't some special skill of mine. Any human could do this without much trouble. The dead mind, shards, felt powerfully wrong. It was a morphic thing, so a soulless creation like Vudak was incapable by definition. My second pass was more involved. The program that Vudak was running allowed each of the fragments an appearance that reflected what sense of self it had, if any. So when I called a shard to the forefront, I would take a few moments to examine the avatar it had forged. Most of the time, there was nothing, just a featureless grey mannequin that imperfectly mimicked the form of a man. However, when something survived, the doll's features would take on some aspect of the mind. It was all very metaphorical. A man who was a carpenter might create a hammer in the hands of his simulacra, or his hands might become hammers. When you fragmented a brain down to this level, shit got weird. The one thing so far that was absolutely certain about our victim was that he was male. A good 60% of the surviving fragments had equipment, freakishly large and more often than not, standing at full attention. Sex is such a fundamental part of neurology that it is the most common survivor of this sort of deep violation. Sometimes when the damage is this absolute, sexuality is the only survivor. I stopped by each one in turn, lightly touching it, seeing how the fragment reacted to the presence of my mind, trying to see if a bridge was even possible. Mostly it was a fruitless endeavor. Some of the fragments that I had initially thought to be salvageable turned out to be rotted shells. Other fragments were undamaged, but contained useless autonomic functions. Finally, the vast majority was simply not bridgeable. They didn't resonate with my soul. Maybe someone else would have the magic, so I flagged them as potentials. I was about 6 hours into my screenings when I got a hit. I felt the thrum of connection the minute I put my hand on the shard. It was a tiny thing, twisted and ruined, but something inside me knew that I could create a whole out of it. It was like those paleontologists who would reconstruct an entire dinosaur skeleton from 3 ribs and a skull. It was not a pleasant sensation. The halo contained hundreds of algorithms to aid in the bridge, and Denise's subordinates, who were overseeing the dive, were spooling out quants into the simulacra to help replace what I was spending. But still, it was deeply personal expense. I felt it in my heart and liver, a burning suction that tugged at the fundament of my soul. To my eyes, the wan and colorless shard was flushed with life and fire. It writhed in agony. And instead of a discordant nonsense, I heard the scream of I. And knowledge hit me like a tidal wave of bricks. I broke the connection and staggered backwards. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel a massive dread looming over me. I knew who our second victim was. We are so fucked. I whispered the words as I settled back on my haunches.